On this Sunday night, Archbishop Desmond Tutu has died. How the human rights icon helped end apartheid in South Africa.
We will be free!
And lead change in the rest of the world. Ontario's surging COVID-19 case counts. How the pandemic is impacting this Boxing Day. COVID cancellations. As Omicron surges in the U.S., air travel is brought to a standstill.
I came in for Christmas and I got stuck here.
And erasing history. Symbols of freedom removed in Hong Kong in a sign of Beijing's tightening grip.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with news from South Africa. Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu has died at age 90. He was an anti-apartheid leader and a voice of justice. South Africa's president called Tutu a patriot without equal. As 𝚂𝚎á𝚗 reports, he's remembered around the world for a life spent fighting for equality.
I'm always a man of hope, and I believe the best about everybody.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu spent a lifetime struggling for change in South Africa, optimistic the apartheid policy in his home country would end one day and that black South Africans could be treated as equals.
Justice is going to win. That goodness is going to overcome evil.
He was known as South Africa's voice of conscience, determined to see the end of a racial divide.
And nothing, absolutely nothing that anyone can do, will do, is going to stop that.
He was passionate about human rights for everybody. He didn't, he absolutely called it as he saw it anywhere he went, anywhere around the world.
The Nobel Peace Prize for 1984.
Tutu won the highest honors for that passion, insisting he share any credit.
It's very heartwarming, but then it is our prize.
Years later, Tutu received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama, who today called Tutu a mentor and moral compass.
Free at last.
Tutu began his career as a teacher in the 60s, but quit in disgust over apartheid policies, setting a course that would guide the rest of his life. While it was Nelson Mandela who led South Africa out of apartheid to an era of reconciliation, Tutu never stopped pushing.
As soon as the new government was formed, there was Desmond Tutu criticizing the new government and saying still problems with human rights, still issues with corruption.
He said the end of apartheid was a wise business move.
The corporations understood the logic of money, even when they weren't swayed by the dictates of morality.
Tutu's legacy:
joy, justice, and peace.
Desmond Tutu was 90 years old. 𝚂𝚎á𝚗, Global News.
To the pandemic now, and a grim new record in Ontario. For the first time, the province has reported more than 10,000 new COVID-19 cases in a single day. Just over 10,400 infections were reported Christmas Day. Another 9,800 new cases were added today, but the true number of cases is likely much higher as testing centres are struggling to keep up. Morgan Campbell reports on the surge and how it's affecting the holiday weekend.
We have all heard the saying, the early bird gets the worm, and taking a look at this lineup outside Best Buy in Scarborough, that phrase appears to ring true. Brian Paul got here at 6:30 in the morning to take advantage of Boxing Day sales.
Usually there's no good deals, and since it's Corona, I was expecting not a lot of people to come out, so I was trying to take advantage of it.
Many lined up trying to get their hands on a good deal. For some, it comes in the form of something they didn't even know they needed until they saw it.
But I got the air fryer actually.
So you got a good deal on this?
Yeah, not bad. $90 off.
Others lined up with electronics in mind, concerned about supply chain issues.
They might still be on the road, on the wharfs, outside of BC and New York City, LA, so Toronto might be limited in regards to what we have here.
Throughout the day, similar lines were found outside stores and malls across the city.
Ahead of the holidays, the Ford government implemented restrictions not just on family gatherings, but also in restaurants and, of course, shopping malls, which is why you are seeing large lineups outside like this one at Vaughan Mills.
The move was made to help curb the spread of COVID-19.
We cannot underestimate the emotional, psychological impact as we head into the third year of this, and how deep-rooted it is and that it may absolutely leave scars.
The number of COVID-19 cases hit as high as 10,000 in Ontario Saturday. Those record-setting numbers didn't stop those out looking for a deal.
I'm double vaxxed. I'm going to go to the car, put hand sanitizer on, not touch my face. I'm wearing my mask. That's all I could really do.
And for those concerned about rising numbers or who weren't quite ready to brave the crowds, there was always the option to shop online for all of those Boxing Day sales. Morgan Campbell, Global News, Toronto.
In Quebec, new restrictions are now in effect as the province tries to get a hold of skyrocketing cases. Starting today, private gatherings are limited to 6 people or 2 family bubbles. No new case numbers were released today because of the holiday, but yesterday the province reported more than 9,200 new infections. In the U.S., surging case numbers are wreaking havoc on holiday travel. According to a flight tracking website, more than 1,000 flights were canceled in the U.S. today alone. Airlines say too many crew members have either tested positive or are in self-isolation. Jennifer Johnson reports on the impacts and the warnings across the U.S. as Omicron cases spike.
From long lines at airports to major backups at COVID-19 testing sites, there was little joy this Christmas for millions of Americans. Many people never got to celebrate the holiday with their relatives.
I came in for Christmas and I got stuck here.
Thousands of flights had to be canceled as the fast-spreading Omicron variant sickened airline staff members.
Not surprising, they have so much public contact that folks, despite best efforts, are coming down with the virus.
Thousands of other Americans were stuck in long lines waiting to get tested for COVID-19, only to be turned away hours later because sites ran out of tests.
Like the Grinch just walked over and talked to me.
After hours of waiting, the lucky ones who could get tested felt like they hit the lottery.
This is the very best Christmas present I could ever have in my life.
The U.S. has seen over 52 million COVID-19 infections. Daily one-day records continue to be shattered in places like New York and Florida. Doctors fear what will happen to America's healthcare system as the virus spreads.
Realize it affects pharmacists. It affects the people who are delivering medications and supplies to cancer patients that need treatment. We're seeing this all across the line.
Some hospitals are so overcrowded, patients are being treated in hallways and parking lot tents. Over 80% of those in intensive care are unvaccinated.
I can't believe that I didn't get the shot. And I will be getting one because I don't want to do this again.
Regrets from at least one patient, as roughly 15% of eligible adult Americans still refuse to get vaccinated. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
A medical mix-up in Australia. Coming up, why a COVID-19 testing lab is apologizing to hundreds of people. A major medical lab in Sydney, Australia is apologizing after telling hundreds of people they tested negative for COVID-19 when they were actually positive. The lab says 400 people were affected. It blamed human error for the mistake. In recent days, parts of Australia have seen a major surge in cases driven by Omicron. Today, New South Wales set a new case record, and hospitalizations are also rising. New restrictions are now in effect across large parts of the UK. In Scotland, new capacity limits took effect today for indoor and outdoor events. In Wales and Northern Ireland, nightclubs have been closed. No new restrictions were imposed in England despite skyrocketing infections. There are reports more measures could be decided on this week. What happened in federal politics this year? Ahead, our Ottawa Bureau looks back at 2021.
You're watching Global National.
With less than a week to go until 2022, it's time to look back at the year that was in Canadian politics. From COVID-19 and Truth and Reconciliation to climate change and the fall federal election, a lot happened in 2021. Let's go to Mercedes Stevenson and our political correspondents in Ottawa for the moments that stood out.
What a year 2021 brought to us indeed, one dominated yet again by the COVID-19 pandemic. 2021 started out with the hope of new vaccines. The rollout was slow at first, leading to more lockdowns in the spring. By June, 20% of Canadians were fully vaccinated. By July, nearly 80% of Canadians had received a first vaccine dose. So in August, the Trudeau government decided to head to the polls, hoping to get a majority, but they got the same result as 2019. And we end the year in much the same way that we started it, with talks of lockdowns, restrictions, and another pandemic wave, something certainly Canadians don't want to talk about, but here we find ourselves, and we're going to be talking about it with our political correspondents here in Ottawa. Joining me is our chief political correspondent, David 𝚂𝚗. He's on remote because we are being very careful in these new variant times. And here in the studio with me are parliamentary correspondents, Mike 𝚂𝚎á𝚗 and Abigail Bimman, both 6 feet away from me, 6 feet away from each other. We're being very careful here. You know, I think last year we all thought that we would get to this year and hopefully not still be talking about COVID-19 as the big story. There's been a lot of stories, though, this year. The election, which also had COVID undertones, military sexual misconduct, how the Conservatives performed, all of these things coming out. We want to find out your real opinions on covering these stories, because we see the side in front of the news, but we don't always get to hear those behind-the-scenes stories and how we process things as reporters. David, let's start with you. What was the standout story for you of 2021?
It has to be the federal election, and the results aside, it's the very fact that we had an election, especially when we look around the world and to our neighbors in the South, that none of the participants challenged the validity of the election. No candidate, no party, no voter. We carried off an election in which, by and large, there is no questions about the legitimacy. There's some issues about people in some northern First Nations communities didn't have polling places. That needs to be tended to, but I think it's a highlight that we got through a federal pandemic election safely, by and large, with no questions about the legitimacy, and I think that's a testament largely to the Elections Canada folks, who I know who were under a lot of pressure and had to work hard to pull off 338 separate races involving thousands of candidates in very trying conditions. So I'd say that's a highlight, and it follows other elections too. In Nova Scotia, they had a provincial election, same thing, safe and worked. Newfoundland and Labrador, they had some hiccups. They had some lockdowns, couldn't do in-person voting back there in February. But we can do elections here in Canada safely in a pandemic where people are not questioning the legitimacy of the results.
Yeah, and certainly something that was a big question mark, how that election would unfold given all of the restrictions and given what we saw our southern neighbors just go through. Abigail, what was the standout story for you this year?
For me, I think it was the pandemic, and you know, you say it exactly right, that there were a lot of people hoping that we wouldn't still be talking about this as a headline at this point, but the issues of how do you have a hybrid parliament, and how much are parties going to work together, and how much will politics play into that? We're still dealing with that pandemic. We're still having these, you know, weekly or sometimes more updates from public health. This is still top of mind. It's still affecting so many people's lives that, for me, it stood out. And also this sense of things feeling the same. I mean, David touched on the idea of the election turning out the same result, but we're in essentially the same place in terms of the breakdown in the House from parties, and it feels very much like we're in the same place in terms of COVID and having these same conversations about restrictions and the state of things. So this idea of sameness, I think, stands out for me across 2021, both on the politics and on the public health front.
Yeah, it really does feel a little bit like the song that never ends, or Groundhog Day, whatever your cultural comparison is, that a lot of us are still processing March of 2020. I feel like I'm still in April of 2020, but at the end of 2021, Mike, what stood out for you?
Yeah, I think, you know, to everybody's point, yeah, COVID-19, the election, I'm going to go off the board for a second here. And I think the highlight for me was unanimous consent on conversion therapy. That was something that I think nobody expected in this parliament. We came back to parliament with the same result as 2019, and a lot of people looked at it and went, well, now we're going to have the same political games. And then somehow, the day that it came on the floor of the House of Commons, the Conservatives surprised everybody and called for a vote on unanimous consent to pass conversion therapy. Why I think this is important, not only because I covered this story, but the ramifications of this. One, that the Conservatives were trying to put this issue behind them so that it wouldn't continue to hang over them. Two, speaking to survivors of it and doing this story. So touching to hear from these people who said that this is so important to them, to finally get through this, to finally have this being illegal on the books, and not only that it happened in the House of Commons, unanimous consent, also in the Senate, how quickly this was passed, maybe gives me a little bit of hope going into the new year that potentially this Parliament can work towards a better end for Canadians. And, you know, talking to that survivor, exchanging emails with him after it was passed, how shocked he was, but so happy he was that this is finally passed through the House.
And certainly a big relief to a lot of people, and a rare showing of not just bipartisan, but all-party support for this, for something that people really felt needed to happen and was the right thing. It's always nice in politics when they're not squabbling and they come together on important issues. David, do you think we're going to see that trend continue, or is it going to devolve into more partisan bickering as we head into 2022?
There was a different kind of partisan bickering, and it's from those who are very angry at the current public health environment. And again, this goes back to the election. All of us were out on the road with various leaders. We traveled around the country. And, Abigail, I think, was there when people were throwing rocks at the Prime Minister, some of which hit members of the media. We were all there to watch angry mobs using the most foul-mouthed obscenities, often with kids in their arms, yelling at political candidates. Didn't matter the candidate. It was New Democrats, it was Liberals. I know Conservative premiers were experiencing this same sort of threats of violence. I've talked to MPs of all parties who say they've never seen an electorate so angry, anger turning into threats, threats sometimes turning into violence. We're going to have an election in Ontario next year in 2022, and I know that Doug Ford's Conservatives, they're the incumbent, and they've been, right there in lockstep with every other province, imposing lockdowns and public health measures to keep us safe, and they are expecting to see the same kind of angry mobs at their rallies that Justin Trudeau's Liberals saw at theirs. So that was a low light for 2021, and that's something to keep an eye on for 2022.
Abigail, you were there, you experienced it. Do you think that this is going to continue into the next year?
I don't want to make any predictions there, because it was just so incomprehensible to watch. Just in terms, not incomprehensible that people are frustrated, not incomprehensible that people are fed up with what's going on. But David touched on it. To see this level of anger is something I've never witnessed before. To feel that tension in those crowds, we all knew that at some point this was going to escalate. You talk about the rock or the gravel, or however you want to describe what was thrown through the crowds that evening. But we all could sense that there was going to be an escalation there, just because of the level of vitriol and the constant profanity and like you say, people holding babies and just screaming their heads off with such a level of anger. So I hope that we don't see that again going forward, but I certainly was caught off guard by the level of intensity and how long it lasted for, that I wouldn't want to make a prediction going forward.
Mike, final to you.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned that this is a line that we've crossed now, and that people think that this is going to be permissible going forward, and that looking at how it all played out. I mean, Abigail, you were there. Everybody who was on that Liberal campaign felt that vitriol from people, and understanding that people now feel like they have the ability to do this and they're allowed to do this. And I hope that we can all take away from this campaign that we look at and go, no, that was the line that we will never cross again. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of faith in that, because I think that people think, I did it once, I can do this again because I have a voice, I'm allowed to do this, and I'm allowed to do this, as you said, in front of kids. And I'm really worried that going ahead in future elections that people are going to say, hey, I'm going to do this again.
Yeah, I think that we're all concerned, and we all hope for a better 2022 in many ways. Let's hope that when we're back here a year from now, it's not another COVID-19 discussion. Maybe our politics are a little bit more positive. Thank you to the three of you for joining us and for all your hard work this year. Colleen, back to you.
Mercedes Stevenson, thank you. Next, why universities in Hong Kong are removing monuments that mark the Tiananmen massacre. Another sign things are changing in Hong Kong. 3 universities this week removed works of art, public monuments commemorating the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. They're the latest examples of the Chinese government's crackdown on political dissent and a further erosion of the one country, two systems principle that was supposed to apply to Hong Kong. Mike Armstrong explains.
It is part of an effort, some have said, to erase public memory. Early Thursday morning, crews worked behind barriers, watched by guards, dismantling a monument. The Danish sculptor who created the work says he was shocked.
In the middle of the night, 12 o'clock in Hong Kong, just one day before Christmas evening, I think it's a really brutal way to do this kind of thing. A really, really brutal way.
From video that was shot, it appears the monument was cut apart, packed up in pieces, and then put in a container. The spot where it stood for 24 years is now empty. This man says the government is trying to wipe out history. People, he says, have to fight against forgetting. It was called the Pillar of Shame, an 8-meter-tall sculpture depicting twisted and pained bodies representing the victims of the Tiananmen massacre. In 1989, Chinese troops broke up demonstrations in Beijing calling for greater political freedoms. The government would say 200 civilians were killed. Others have said the number was closer to 10,000. For decades, there were vigils in Hong Kong to mark the anniversary. 2 years ago, they were banned, as they are in mainland China. Instead, students protested by cleaning the artwork. Other vigils were larger. Thousands marched despite the ban, but dozens of activists and politicians were arrested and prosecuted. Now, 2 other Hong Kong universities have also removed artwork inspired by the Tiananmen crackdown. A painting at one university was painted over. At another, 2 monuments were pulled down. A statue that had been in this park and a monument that had been on this wall. The artist responsible for both says they were removed at night as though by thieves. He says the universities and the government are trying to get rid of parts of history. It's made him feel, he says, as though the rule of law and freedom in Hong Kong are dead. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Colleen Christie. We leave you tonight with images from the remarkable life of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The Nobel Peace Prize winner and racial justice activist died today in Cape Town, South Africa. He was 90 years old. Thanks for watching. Hope you'll join us here again tomorrow. Good night.